Next Sunday's lesson, I think you'll have a good experience with. You'll notice that it's from two passages in Mark 11, and then there's a section in Mark 12 that the lesson deals with. But this is the portion of Jesus' ministry, which again now is entering into its last week. The entrance into Jerusalem, the Hosanna walk, all of the recognition of those who were crying out Hosanna to Jesus takes place in chapter 11. And so we come to Jesus in the temple. And this is the second time that he will be cleansing the temple from all of the merchandising that's going on in the house of God. All right? And I've included all this in the notes, but the big idea is Jesus desires pure worship expressed by total trust in God. All right? And so the initial part of the lesson is him cleansing the temple. And a couple things that you'll read about in here, and I've tried to make it as clear as possible, but Jesus entered into the outer court of the temple, which... Does anybody remember what it was called? The outer court? The court of the Gentiles. And with the expansion that Herod the Great did to the temple compound, this was about 35 acres up on this platform where the temple was at. And that was much larger than it had been ever before. In fact, a lot of the selling of the offerings and things like that had actually been across the Kidron Valley and over on the Mount of Olives. But once the court of the Gentiles expanded so much larger, they had moved all that stuff right into the temple confines. And so that's what Jesus is observing when he cleanses the temple. And of course, the question about anger, I've heard people that said Jesus was angry when he did that and sinned because it was anger. Well, of course, that's not the case. It's clear in the scriptures, and I included it in there from Ephesians 4, be angry and sin not. There's such a thing as a righteous indignation. And that's what Jesus exhibited when he saw God's house being turned into a den of thieves, is what he called it. And so when he purged the temple, and explained to them, because it says he taught them why he did what he did, that they had turned his father's house into a den of thieves. And so part of the emphasis of the lesson is this whole idea of what the Jews had turned this into as really just I call it temple concessions. They were selling and changing money and all that. When Jesus saw that, he finally reacted in a way that honored God by what his reaction was. You've heard me probably say it before. I've included it in a couple of lessons over the years, but I included it once again in this lesson. You never see Jesus respond in anger when he is personally offended. You only see Jesus respond when God is being offended. And I think that's the line, because most of us respond in anger when we are offended. And the truth of the matter is, as much as Jesus was abused, even in the week that we're talking about, he never responded in anger, only in concern and sympathy. All right? So I think that's something for us to think about. I also included a line that I've never really thought much about, but because of this situation, Jesus also included the statement that he would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. Do you remember reading that? Well, what had happened was this. They had turned the temple courtyard into a shortcut through the city. Because people carrying their groceries and other things, rather than go all the way around the hill and the temple compound, they just started making it a thoroughfare. And they had so reduced what was the place of worship to something that was commonplace
That was part of what Jesus' rebuke
Sounds like
was.
a big flea market almost.
It really is a good way to explain it. It was a bazaar. And Jesus condemns the fact that they are merchandising in the gospel, or at least in the Word of God. Okay? And part of that I explained in some detail, because the next part of it says that the chief priests and the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they are fearful of Jesus. And again, just the day before this, he had come into town and a whole bunch of people were crying out, Messiah, Hosanna to the King, right? And now they are realizing that he's taking this initiative. He is being bold in rebuking them. And that's when they're just getting more and more animated about, we've got to get rid of this guy. All right? Part of that fear, the point number 2 there, is the fact that Annas, you remember we've talked about him, he's the one in control of these temple concessions. And on 2 different occasions, Jesus has been bad for business. And so that's another part of this equation. They've got to get rid of him because the whole people are following his doctrine, but they're also fearful that he's one of the few who will stand up to them and to the adulterous things that they have done related to the worship of God at the temple. Okay? And it's really interesting, and I included it in the notes, but Annas had been high priest on multiple occasions. His son John, his son Alexander, all of them had been high priests. And at this time, his son-in-law was the high priest. Who's that? Caiaphas. And the reason why they are so upset about Jesus disrupting their business is they were making a mint on all the stuff that was going on in the temple. And Jesus was a threat to all of that. Okay? And then we jump over to Mark 12, and it's where Jesus, again, is going to be in the courtyard of the temple. Now he's going to move into the inner court, the court of the women, just outside the holy place. And that's where he's going to watch this little old widow woman come and give her gifts to God. And yes, and everything that he was observing was all of the ostentatious display of giving. And here comes this little woman who gave all that she had. And Jesus makes the point, she's given more than all of them. Not in amount, but in her heart attitude about giving, knowing that she could trust God, even though it was her last. She trusted that God would make it right and take care of her. Okay? You'll have fun with this one, I'm pretty
That's
sure.
why we have offering envelopes now, so people can show off.
Yes, and we don't let you sound trumpets either.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Have a good